Hello, welcome to this week's presentation on our brain, how it works, and why that matters. I'm Troy Faddis, licensed marriage and family therapist.
Hi, I'm Dr. Maddy Liebing, psychologist and licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm happy to be here.
So today I wanted to start out by talking about our brain and a little bit about the parts of our brain, because knowing what part of our brain is working at any given time, it does affect us. We can know maybe what is the motivation behind what we think or behind what we feel. And we can know more about trusting that and being or maintaining control, because our brain is often trying to seek efficiency, and sometimes it will hijack our own logic to achieve our efficiency. So here's a picture of the brain. And it started out with the cortex and the limbic system. And to probably a little bit of an overgeneralization, but if we break these two, the limbic system has had a long time to develop. And because of that, it is a lot more efficient to run. The energy it takes to run those first basic reactions that we have, the emotions that we feel, the primitive instincts like fight, flight, freeze, fawn, to protect ourselves, those are pretty hardwired responses. And they happen a lot like a closed loop system, like when the doctor takes his patella hammer and he puts us on the table and our legs dangle and he hits the patella tendon and our leg pops up. That's a lot like our limbic system. It's efficient, it's quick, and it has very specific set programmed ways of responding. And the brain has a lot of rules. And some of those rules that our brain has is to protect us at all times. And so it doesn't have a moral compass. It's not saying what's right or what's wrong. It just says, right now, what will protect us. The second rule that the brain has is to conserve. That's why we're always trying to create prejudices, is what we call them, in our mind. We're always trying to find a way to get things to working memory so they become natural or second nature. It's like the first time that you drove a manual car, you probably had to think. You use the cortex a lot. You had to think about the gas, the clutch, the gear, the brake, and you're doing that. But eventually, it got to working memory, and you did it without thinking. Same thing with typing. Maybe at first you hunted and pecked for the right word or the right letter. Eventually, you just started typing, and now you don't think about it. That's the efficiency or the conserve energy component of the rules. So this is more of a psychological construct, but David Rock, in his book, Your Brain at Work, and a couple of other people call it, so he calls it the director. Some other people, they call it the monitor. And this is more of a psychological construct. But in the psychological construct, what can happen is that our director is constantly looking for all input, what we see, smell, taste, hear, all of that, and is creating a binary choice, 1 zeros, 1 zeros, 1 zeros. And the binary choice, again, number one is to protect. So the question it is asking, is it safe or is it unsafe? And then the second question it's going to ask is, how much can I conserve? And so if it feels like it's safe and it doesn't already have a pre-programmed solution, it will send that input to the cortex. And as we get older, our cortex develops, and that allows us to think about like how this might affect other people, think about how we could play the tape forward. how a decision or something we might do might affect us later, not just in the moment. Those are all cortex issues. But if the director or monitor, and the director's doing the safe, unsafe, the conserve, not conserve, unless we've given it its own script, that script will default. Because the director's a lot like our nervous system. And there's an automatic nervous system and there's a conscious nervous system. And sometimes a function might be both. An example of both is breathing. Most of the time, breathing is an automatic nervous system. Our body will breathe for us. But if we want to take a deep breath, we can. That's what makes it also a conscious nervous system. The director is much the same. It will conserve energy and make decisions on its own without us even knowing the decisions if we're not being really conscious, like being conscious about your breath. A lot of times I'm in therapy and I'll say to a client who's anxious or worried or scared, hey, I think you're not breathing. Stop and take a deep breath. And they're like, yeah. And just that act itself can be so calming because the director is so in the limbic system, and the forcing of a breath can put us into our cortex.
Can I jump in there for a second? And that's why at the beginning of all of our groups, we always have our clients take it, and even in our meetings, is take a moment of awareness. And I always suggest to make sure that you've got 3 really good deep breaths so that we can bring ourselves into a place where we're not just operating from the limbic system, but we can activate the cortex and be able to hear what's going to be said and process what's going to be said and make it beneficial in the process. So breathing is huge.
Yeah. So another reason why I like to name the director is that we can give it the script we want. If we don't, it will come up with one on its own. But we can program. Now, the scientists that talk about the monitor, they usually do talk about the monitor being a little bit different in that the monitor is more goal-directed. Like, if I want an outcome, it's always telling me, am I getting closer or further away from that outcome? And that's that monitor. And the closer I get, oftentimes, the more it will engage the cortex. The further away I get, the more it tends to, hardwired, go to the limbic system. If we think there's a problem, we're hardwired to fix problems with negative emotions. I don't know if I said this, the limbic system is where a lot of our emotion come from. And so when I say limbic, sometimes I also use that interchangeably with emotion. Obviously, other parts of the limbic system are things like our reward system, things that feel good, reinforcing, and also extinguishing, like pain.
And so with the limbic, we want sort of instant gratification. We want to have that reward right away. The cortex allows us to delay gratification, to be goal-oriented and to look forward and say, if I do these 3 steps or 4 steps, then I will get whatever the reward is. But the limbic wants it to happen and wants it to happen now.
Yeah. The limbic system does not get the principle of the delayed harvest. Mm-hmm. Only the cortex can.
Well, and here's another kind of tough thing I'm just going to throw out there, is that the frontal lobe, a good part of its cortex, doesn't really fully develop in humans until about the mid-20s, whereas the limbic is active from the moment the baby comes out.
Yep.
So that's one of the reasons why a lot of our clients struggle, because they have a harder time activating the cortex and are operating more from the limbic system. And so we have to, some of it is a maturation process.
Yep.
When they're a little bit older, it's a little bit easier, but we still have to be able to help them to do that in order to not make decisions that are going to be harmful.
Mm-hmm. Actually, we all are. And I can see myself so often being more limbic.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually one of the techniques that I think is really helpful, is being able to be aware of which part of my mind is this really coming from. So the director is, sending things here or is sending things there. And depending on, like you said, like life experience, I was thinking when you talked about, like, since a baby, the moment we're born, Sue Johnson talks about that, how our first language, it is our emotions. An infant does communicate with us right away.
Mm-hmm.
But language, anyways, becomes more of a cortex issue. So this is an easier part to operate. It operates faster. So we always default to it if we're not really paying attention. If we're not paying attention, it will hijack us. And we can almost always tell, I think you're saying this, Maddy, when someone is in their limbic system, because their constant reactions is to fight or to flight, they freeze or they fawn. And we can see that by people being defensive or being on the offense. And it's just instantaneous.
Or just plain stuck, like they can't go any direction. And
Mm-hmm.
would you explain fawn? Because I think most people have heard those trauma responses or stress responses of fight, flight, or freeze. But could you explain fawn a little bit, Troy?
Yeah, there's actually on the YouTube channel, there's another little web class I did on the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. They can go back to that as well. And I also encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can get alerted, click the little bell. And every time we get a new video up, you'll be alerted. But fawn, and it's not like, because a lot of times we fall into these roles of being a caretaker, and that's not necessarily what I mean. Unless, like, your roles are all coming from your limbic system. And they may be. But for the most part, when we are threatened, remember, one of our rules is, may the rules last, is to protect. And so if someone's in our space and they're threatening us, again, it's fight, flight, freeze, or our brain tells us the best way to keep ourselves safe is to try to placate the other person. Let them know, like, hey, calm down, let me soothe you. You're not trying to soothe them because you want to, like, help. You're soothing them because you're afraid. It's an instantaneous reaction. It's like when you say something to your child, not because you really mean it, but because you just want to de-escalate the situation. Like, you give in, let them take the car, you tell them that you don't care if they're smoking pot. It's often not what you really think or really feel, but you're just trying to take care of them because you don't want them to be any more escalated and for things to get worse.
So placating in the case of escalation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. But those are all of our instantaneous reactions. And the other ones that maybe are not as noticeable, but we all need to feel like we belong. Which I think one of the reasons, like, the Irish have a saying that everyone focuses on the drink and not the reason for the drink. And I think behind that a lot is this need to belong, at least at the beginning. Feel like I'm capable or I fit. The other things we need is to feel significant. We need to be able to feel like we have capabilities, self-efficacy, and a role that's meaningful to us and our group of people. We need relationships. We need to be able to connect. We need to be able to produce. And I put substance abuse, and the font's a little bit bigger. And the reason why is, like, and I know there's a lot of studies that add to this, but back in the 70s, Dr. Oles did a lot of the experiments with the mice where he would take the rods and insert them into the brains right here into the limbic system or into the midbrain, right around this area. In fact, the other areas he inserted them, he mostly used cocaine because cocaine, you had observable results. If they used alcohol or pot, the mice would just fall asleep. So the cocaine, we got observable responses. Up here, didn't have an effect. Right here, this is where it had an effect. And I think that's significant too. But what Dr. Olds found in those studies is that those mice, like these things are paramount, like the need to protect ourselves. I do. I put protect. That's usually the first one in terms of the order of our brain's automatic functions. But he found that with substance use, that this substance abuse came up here and it now became the first one. That those mice would seek the substance use before self-preservation, like food, water, electrical fields, even sex. I'm not sure how they did that, but they did. And so, like that substance abuse becomes tagged as number one by the limbic system. I mean, the limbic system is trying to find the fastest solution to soothe and soothe the pain, find a solution. And the limbic system does not have like a right or wrong. It just has what works. The cortex is what adds right and wrong, not the limbic system.
Well, right and wrong for the limbic system is the thing that keeps you safe and uses the least energy and gets it done as quick as possible.
That's right. Yeah. So I think like just we'll talk a little more about interventions later, but and part of this is about substance use because I think it's important how quickly substance use can get tagged, but it's not the only thing. I mean, when we look at some of the studies, they overlap. Studies about anxiety in particular really overlap with substance use. Like people who chronically experience high levels of anxiety have a lot of the same functions in that they feel an amount of distress that they need to resolve right now, and they get into some of the same type of self-soothing functions as like to use substance abuse, for example, but also maybe just to vegetate and watch TV. It might be to avoid. It might be to, look at porn or to masturbate or have sex. All of those are soothing behaviors. And in fact, outside of relationships, what sometimes it's called co-regulation. Co-regulation is the most efficient way to soothe, and so we're often looking to other people. That's why we have mirror neurons. If we can seek soothing and we can tell the person seeking soothing from us, our mirror neurons want to provide that soothing, at least initially. And so we always try to co-regulate. When co-regulation is not possible or doesn't work, that's when we try to co-regulate with something, not necessarily someone. So something being substance use, something being TV, something being sex. Whatever I have to do to co-regulate. Go ahead, Maddy.
So what you're saying is that if we can co-regulate with the person in a relationship, that's a healthy way to help the limbic system to handle stress and distress and all that stuff. And that's why relationships and connection and having, for example, a healthy recovery community when someone's working through substance abuse recovery is so essential because it keeps us from picking other harmful ways to be able to deal with stress and the other concerns that the limbic system's looking into.
I think some of the newest studies show that it's actually the way that we're most wired is to co-regulate.
Mm-hmm.
George Fowler, was one of the presidents for the EFT School of New York, or EFT Center for New York. He calls it COCO, co-regulate.
And then Sue Johnson talks about that too, that we're hardwired for connection. And so that's why attachment is so huge and why we spent so much time talking about that and recognizing that that's kind of the core. Oh, I mean, there's even real simple studies like they've shown that a strong relationship between parents and children are one of the best ways to help kids to avoid developing substance abuse. And that doesn't mean for clients who already have developed it, that you failed as a parent or anything like that, because there were other things that were involved in this process. But it shows that from a foundational level, that connection and relationships are really the key to both beginning that process of going in a healthy way, and repairing that if that's gotten off keel, and helping people to be able to change to come back to a healthy way of operating. That really is the center. And I think it's one of the key pieces in our program too, is the community. I was talking to a prospective client today, and he said that he's nervous being around people, that groups of people make him uncomfortable. And I said, well, that's hard, because we aren't placed on planets by ourselves. We need to be with people, and it's going to be really difficult for you to overcome your cocaine addiction if you try to do it all by yourself. And that's what AA is about. It's about a community of people and being able to strengthen that connection and relationships in order to be able to soothe and help the limbic system going through this process of change and recovery.
Mm-hmm. I think that's actually some of the research that's been added to Dr. Ohl's experiments, is that he didn't really look at the mice were mostly in isolation, and when he puts them now, when studies are being done with the mice in social groups, that they're having a bit of a different reaction, meaning that the social aspect of that group can actually become more important than the substance use.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that works really well with wilderness is that you automatically create a community. It's the most interesting thing. You can take a couple of people that don't even know each other and go for a 3-day excursion, hiking in the wilderness, backpacking, rappelling, some kind of activity that requires everybody to work together, and the connections that they make will be significant and long lasting, and put people in a place to be able to really get to a place of being able to heal. And the community that's created when you're actually living together outdoors creates a very strong community very quickly, and gives you an opportunity to be able to use that moving forward.
Yeah. Well, I think you said too, we can see this in our clients, we can see it in ourselves too, but usually with our clients, they have been in this part of their mind, like this part of the mind has been in control for a long time, and they may not even know that there's another part of their mind. They haven't accessed it for a long, long time. And not just like the clients who are here, but even like the family members, because they equally are mirror neurons in crisis with them. And so they've been back there for a really long time. And that is one of the things that, again, other studies like Dr. Keith Russell and a bunch of the other professors who are helping us at the OBH Center at the University of New Hampshire, they talk about what we can see is that when we come into wilderness, most of us are here stuck. But just being outdoors, and I think it's outdoors, I think there's a bunch of things to it. In fact, but Gary Ferguson, in his research in his books, he talks about there being an impact on the mind of it being about the mystery, the beauty, and the community. Dr. Keith Russell calls it soft fascination. And what they find is that just time outdoors and movement gets us to calm our limbic system so it doesn't believe. Because what ends up happening is our director gets hypersensitive. When we're in constant crisis or there's been major trauma, our director becomes not hypersensitive, hyper aroused to potential hurt, especially similar hurt. And so it's got like a hair trigger. And so it's reading situations intensely, and it can probably pick up information, nuances, but it does not necessarily interpret it well. And so it can read it, but it's sending it to the limbic system quickly before we can do anything else with it. Being outdoors, and there's other things too, like bilateral stimulation.
Let's
can
wait till we
help.
get to the let's wait till we get to the thing for
Okay.
some of this. What I just want
Okay.
to just kind of develop that just a little bit more. Like for
Hmm.
example, if you have a child who has experienced abuse as a child, or has a parent or a caretaker who has problems with drugs or alcohol, like and become an adult, and adult children of alcoholics with this really common, is that what happens is that they become hyper vigilant. They are watching really, really closely to pick up any kind of signal of something going wrong with their caretaker, because then they can run for the door, get under the bed, get in the closet, whatever they need to do to try to protect themselves. Again, operating totally from the limbic system. And what they've developed is the ability to read micro cues, tiny, tiny cues in their caretaker's face and body language and intonation, all the different kinds of analog communication that talk louder than actual words, and then they respond to it. But then what happens is then they're out of that situation where they're no longer, living with a harmful caretaker or a neglectful one if they're having problems with substance abuse, and so they continue to do the same thing in all of their relationships. And so, like somebody would say something that sounds maybe just a tiny bit negative, and they overreact to it. It's like this huge reaction to, oh my gosh, and you go, whoa, whoa, you talk about people overreacting. Part of it is that their director has a script about if this person exhibits this behavior or this cue, then you better react. And a lot of times as they get older, the reaction becomes less flight and more fight, because they start fighting back. And that's why a lot of times we'll get some really angry clients. And it's like they're just tired of running and now they're fighting back. And they're overreacting to cues because they're going to this automatic response instead of being able to process it in their cortex. And so we spend a lot of time processing, like take some space, take a deep breath, slow things down, come back, and now let's talk about what really happened. And do I feel statements and all those kinds of things to try to help people see how they jumped immediately to the limbic system, and where they really need to go is the cortex, and be able to see what's really happening and ask the other person what's really going on.
So parasympathetic is the PNS, and the SNS is the sympathetic nervous system. And the reason why I wanted to point these out is, again, it's like the automatic versus conscious nervous system a little bit too. But the cortex, it takes a lot more energy, so it's not the most efficient part of the brain to use. But that's like our braking system. So if we're going to put our foot on the brake, say, whoa, hey, calm down, let's de-escalate, let's stop and pause, or zoom out, that's usually a sympathetic nervous system function or a cortex function. That uses a lot of energy. Where the PNS is in the body. The PNS is the parasympathetic nervous system, is also, it's not just part of the brain, it's the limbic system, but it goes all the way down the brain stem. And it's our lungs, it's our heart, it's our gut, it's everything down there. And that's why what we feel in our body are so connected. But it's also the gas pedal. So putting your foot on the gas is a lot easier than putting your foot on the brake. And that's why when we have a body response, sometimes it's just like foot on the gas. And it can go both ways. Most of us have had extreme emotions where we've been so upset, we've gotten sick in our stomach. We get so worried, we can't sleep. We get so panicked that we maybe hyperventilate and feel this weight in our heart rate increases. And I think that the it's like, I've been told that in baseball that professional pitchers are pitching so fast, there really is not enough time for them to respond. And so it must be an anticipation. And so they're getting really good in anticipating and then responding to that anticipation to be a good hit, to be a designated hitter. And the same thing is true with us. For us to take our foot off the gas, put our foot on the brake, and be able to do that effectively, we have to be able to anticipate. And the best way to anticipate is noticing our body, And this is where I think mindfulness about what we're feeling, but mindfulness about our body's experience is one of the most effective ways of anticipating and then maintaining the ability to keep us in control, not to let our limbic system hijack us.
It's like in DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, or EMDR. One of the things you're continually asking is, when someone identifies an emotion, is where you're feeling it in your body, and being able to identify that helps to be able to either let that go or just notice it. And then in the noticing it, you're moving more into the cortex and you're becoming more conscious in that thought. And a lot of times that that physical response will be lessened. But unfortunately, what happens in trauma, and we're going to talk about that more in another session, is that it's such an automatic response that a lot of times those fear responses get stuck in parts of our body and just stay there for long periods of time. And several of the trauma experts that we've emerged in the last few years talk about that. For example, Bessel van der Kolk talks about, Bessel van der Kolk talks about the body keeps the score, is that we are, amassing bodily responses. And that's why over a long period of time, people have things like ulcers and asthma, and even cancer is increased. Migraine headaches. There's just so many physical things that we have that are connected to our limbic system automatically storing stuff in our parasympathetic nervous system without us even realizing that it's there, and then not being able to know how to connect with it or how to let that go.
And then, I've talked about the rules before. Number one is to protect, second is to conserve. And then, I don't want to add too much information to this chart, but I do think there's a lot of hormones and neurotransmitters that have as much of an impact, or their response at least, to the impact of what we're receiving and how our director is interpreting them. And some of those things are like our dopamine, our cortisol, and our oxytocin. I forgot to put oxytocin on there. Like our oxytocin is sometimes they call it the bonding hormone. It's released often with expressions of affection, physical touch, skin contact, and it helps us feel bonded to someone else. Like it's a neurological wiring is what oxytocin does. Dopamine is another feel good, when you feel euphoric or happy or joy. It's usually a dopamine response. But cortisol is a stress hormone. It's not like eustress, where eustress can be motivating. Cortisol is that something's wrong, and if cortisol is dumping in the head, it's almost guaranteed that we've got this. And Dr. Gottman talks about monitoring physiological responses in the body. And he says that when we can monitor a person's, or a couple, he does couples therapy, response, and we can watch their heart rate, and they go from a resting heart rate to arguing, and now their heart rate's over 100 beats per minute. 100 is the key. That the cortisol levels increase, and it's guaranteed that they're in their limbic system. And so how many couples are now fighting, and they're fighting limbic system to limbic system? And things that might be said, or hurts that might be used, or words that might be weaponized, because it's all limbic. It's about conserve, protect. The monitor is about goal. In fact, Dr. Gottman says in his research that women seem to be a little bit better monitor as far as learning to calm it down and say, okay, self-soothe, get out of this. But men, when they cross that threshold, the monitor seems to stay engaged to win. And then they seem to stay physically upset until they get their way, or they get their right. Until the other person acquiesces, they're staying in that limbic system.
So it's a lot easier to put your pedal to the metal and push the gas pedal And it goes a lot faster than trying to get your foot over onto the other side and try to start pushing that brake pedal.
And as Dr. Gottman says, particularly for men.
Yeah, I can see that. That's the testosterone, right?
Sure. That's another hormone I should have put up there, right?
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So should we go to the next slide? Yeah, the scarf model. Let's.
Yep. The reason why I put the scarf model in here is I think it just helps us look a little bit more of the director. So, the director, Maddie, you were talking about how sometimes they become hyper aroused. I think that because of our experience, and I believe it was Sue that said this, and it could have been Jim Thomas, talks about how most of the moves we make either comes from our family of origin or the relationship we're currently in. But we have had a lot of experiences, and sometimes it may even be genetically wired, where like we can see trauma responses that actually get wired during the first trimester of a pregnancy, and we can now be more sensitive to certain things because of our wiring at birth. A lot of the Holocaust studies can show that as well. But our monitor can get hypersensitive, and the neuroscience, like Dave Rock talks about this in his book, where the monitor or the director is most sensitive to these 5 things. He calls it the scarf model. The first is status. If something is going to take, we feel safe by having a certain amount of influence. We lose that influence and we become really reactive. We're not thinking, we're reacting. Certainty. We all sort of have we like a little bit of novelty. We do. Like everyone wants to have the thing that's just a little bit unique. Like when iPods first came out and everyone wanted one, but then the black iPods came out, not the white ones. Oh, everyone wanted the black iPod. It was still an iPod. It looked the same, but it was like that little bit of novelty, but it was the certainty that it was an iPod. I was going to do what I wanted. We do this in relationships. We do this in all kinds of things. We look for certainty. The third is autonomy. We are really wired, especially as we get older and we're hitting that 16, as you said, 25, maybe even a little bit older now. Our need for autonomy is like increasing. And our sensitivity to anything that's taking from that sense of autonomy, we become really sensitive to it. Our relationships. One of our basic needs is to belong and to feel significant with someone else in our life. And the way we bid for that can either be secure or insecure. But we're sensitive to that. We're sensitive to how they respond to us. And I think it's related to autonomy, which is this sense of fairness. You get this developmental again, 16, 17, 18, where there's this hypersensitivity of what's fair, what's not fair. The world is not fair. And the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing is to rectify it. And, a deficiency mindset versus an abundance mindset. But these are the things that our mind are just wired to be sensitive to if left to themselves. Like I said, it's like breathing. It will do it automatically most of the time. But we can program it if we take the time to deliberately do so.
Yeah, and I think that's extremely important, because what we can do is we can strengthen and develop neural pathways in our brain. And that's where you write a different script, where you choose to do something different and you practice it. And the more you practice it, whether it's a thought pattern or whether it's a specific skill, but the more that you practice it, you actually develop these neural pathways that allow you to access that particular skill, that particular narrative or thought pattern more quickly, and then you can do it with less effort.
Thanks, y'all, for joining us. I hope that my encouragement to all of you this week is to just ask yourself, what part of the brain am I in? And Notice if it's more emotionally reactive or it's just reactive in general. It could be reactive, not just emotions, it could be reactive with thoughts. It could be reactive with solutions.
Mm-hmm.
It can be reactive with emotions. Or it could just be goal-oriented of soothing. Or are you in your cortex? Are you up here? Are you able to think about the impact on other people, the future, zooming out and playing the tape forward? And just practice that this week and see what type of impact it has on your sense of confidence, your sense of soothing, and your effectiveness in relationships with others.
And next week, we're going to talk more about solutions and how to get out of those negative cycles, and how that talk about a lot of different skills to be able to help you to be able to access the cortex more. But this week, we just want to increase awareness of where you're operating from. So thank you so much for being with us.
Yep. Be healthy, be happy.
Yep. See ya.